I've been scrutinizing Mafex for quite a while now, especially around their Spider-Man figures, but did they just deliver the definitive Batman? More often than not, people look at either Batman Hush, Knightfall Batman, or maybe even Batman the Animated Series, or 1975 Batman, or Long Halloween Batman as their definitive portrayal of the character. And now we have a actual, legitimate, pulled directly from the comics, Knightfall Batman from Medicom Mafex. And this is where things get just a little peculiar with me because straight from the get-go, I can see that a little bit of DNA pulled from some prior existing, not just Mafex Batman figures, but rather Mafex figures just in general across the board, I can see kind of replicated here or there. You see an awful lot of their quintessential DNA, but at the same time, you can't really knock that towards the company. An awful lot of toy companies like to do that after a while, especially when the cost of inflation and manufacturing and things like that start to play a very significant role in the process, especially in the year of our Lord 2024, and most of you already probably know that by now. But can the Knightfall Mafex Batman here really stack up? In terms of height, he's really not going to stack up too much broadly than your average McFarlane toys because obviously they're going to be making them to scale to fit with the rest of your Mafex shelf. So he's roughly about 5.5, closer to about 6 inches than the much more enlarged 7 inches. However, they opted to go for this aesthetic that leans more towards a darker gray as opposed to the brighter gray from the McFarlane. Naturally, I need to put them right next to each other to see exactly where sometimes certain companies are going to take creative liberties with their interpretation of Knightfall Batman. You can see that Mafex opted for the much more comic accurate look, whereas McFarlane kind of did their own thing where, yeah, you have some iconography, if you want to call it that, that is very much seminal for a Knightfall Batman, specifically the yellow symbol, the oval symbol there in the chest, along with the yellow belt, and then of course the underoos. And you have some kind of gray hue encompassing the majority of the suit, with the exception being, of course, the gauntlets and the boots and the cowl and the mask. That's going to be like the saturated baby blue. But the gray itself, as you can see, rather differs across different companies. I would even say that if a company like Spin Master were to come up with a Knightfall Batman, which likely they won't because they cater to the younger demographic, and most of them are not going to know what Knightfall is, they would probably have their own gray completely. I would bet money that they would go for a completely different gray that you would expect out of these two. But technically speaking, the more accurate one would be on Mafex. Other than that, it really falls onto you as far as preference. To me, I feel like the Clash works a little better with the McFarlane as far as the color scheming, as far as the actual I guess you could say color theory of the figure itself is working. Everything else, Mafex is very much slowly winning me over with the physique, with the actual little details that really makes this character actually leap from the comics, as opposed to simply just looking like a generic Batman that just happens to have a Knightfall skin. It's kind of similar to when you can dress up the Arkham Knight Batman with the Knightfall skin in Arkham Knight. You can still tell that it's Arkham Knight Batman, but he just happens to be wearing the Knightfall suit. This is kind of like where McFarlane falls into, but for $22.99, you really can't complain too much. You still see decent amount of sculpting within the actual look of the cloth, and then of course the overall aesthetic of the character, while at the same time maintaining the scale with the rest of your DC Multiverse figures. But then you'll notice that certain characteristics and certain personality traits are lost on the head sculpt. You don't see the little spikes on the shoulder. You see just an awful lot of very general stuff with this Batman, whereas Mafex, they brought forward the very angular ears on top of the head sculpt. You see the grimace, you see the chin, you see an awful lot of this very comic influenced head sculpt that really works for me. And then of course the little spikes on the shoulders of the cape itself. Then you move down to where you have an awful lot of that bulkiness to his physique, to the point where this son of a bitch actually has an 8-pack. That's not a 6-pack, that's an 8-pack, ladies and gentlemen. You see 6 right there, but then if you move things, just extend them a little further, you see 2 extra little packs right above the belt right there. I am adamant that that is an 8-pack, and I could literally grill my cheese on top of that thing. Same thing goes for the bat symbol. At first I thought it was a little bit too small and it was just going to be this simple painted app, but lo and behold, it's actually etched into the plastic. A very nice touch. And though I just mentioned at the top of the review that an awful lot of the DNA or the architecture of certain Mafex figures, specifically Batman, are going to start to come through a little bit here, like when you get to the limbs, I would say the limbs are probably the best dead giveaway that I could have sworn I saw directly lifted from the Hush Buck, where you have, there goes that term again, the Hush Buck. And even Mafex is guilty of this. McFarlane is not exclusive to this. They kind of took a few pieces like the shoulders, the biceps, the thighs, the legs, just overall this kind of build to the overall thing, just muted the gray a little bit to then fit a bit more of a universal look to this specific suit. But at least if you can tell that your thing is going to be quality, then do so. And you see an awful lot of that musculature and the tearing of the certain parts of the body come through, but at least it's all very complementary to one another. And most importantly, we don't have any kind of scaling issues. We don't have any kind of proportion issues that to me stand out. To me, I feel like from top to bottom, this guy feels legit and he has a presence to him. If I was to nitpick something, it would be that I would really like for the little divide between the blue of the gauntlets and the gray of the rest of the suit, or rather the boots, to be a bit more present, to be a bit more pronounced, because it is technically there. At first, when I pulled them out of the package, I felt like the gauntlets and the boots were rather just painted onto the plastic, and that initially disappointed me up until I looked a little closely and noticed that, yeah, there actually is a little bit of a sculpted line to then kind of separate the gauntlets along with the boots away from the rest of the suit. So it is technically there, just wish that it was a bit more pronounced to kind of give it an added layer of quality. But everything else still pans out rather well. Mine came a little warped with the little spikes on the gauntlets, but that could just simply be my isolated unit because only one had a little bit of a warp going on, whereas the one on the left was pretty much straightforward. So I feel like that's just a very specific problem to me. Other than that, though, you'll see right here that not only is the body really working well of delivering this specific comic accurate Knightfall, but it's this goddamn cape. I gotta be honest. This is probably one of my favorite capes on a Mafex in a really long time, because not only does it clash and work really well with the rest of the blue, it's practically the exact same hue of blue used on the rest of the plastics, so there's no kind of diminishing returns there. But to me, what's most important is that not only do you have the quality of the cloth very much high and pretty premium, I guess you could say, but it's actually tailored to match the height of the figure. It's just stitched and tailored perfectly. And here's why that's important. One of my greatest complaints about the Hush Mafex Batman is this goddamn cape. Look at this thing. It's just dragging, it's bending, and despite the strength of the wires on the Hush, you can see right here, I have to finagle it and kind of move it out of the way because this cape is way too long. And sure, it could fit into the aesthetical look of that character in the comic, specifically on certain panels where you can see kind of like the cape kind of blowing in the wind, and it's meant to be uncharacteristically longer than it's supposed to, just for that kind of, like I said, stylized effect. But as a figure, it just doesn't work, or at least throw in a secondary cape so that we can swap it for something that's a bit stitched and pulled back, so that in case we ever do want to display our Mafex Batman figures in a museum pose, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be pulling on the figures. It's not going to be pulling on other figures. And in the case that I want to pull this guy from the shelf, but then this cape drags others with it, and boom, we have just one of the worst nightmare disasters for any collector, specifically ones that like to use detolf cases and want to fill those things to the brim with all their collectibles. And you can kind of already see where the end result is going to be with that. Whereas with Knightfall Batman here, they managed to tailor the cape perfectly in terms of height, in terms of length, in terms of making sure that it complements the figure and still, like I said, delivers on that shelf presence where it's like cone-shaped, upside-down cone-shaped. You have it down this way while at the same time complementing the shoulders. It doesn't feel finagly. And then on top of that, the wires are very, very strong at not only keeping this neutral look alive, but also whenever I started to kind of extend the wires, they look beautiful. You have, technically speaking, 4 wires, 2 on the outside rims of the capes themselves, and then 2 to kind of separate the cape into thirds, one right here and then one right here. So there's no middle one. Could have appreciated one right down and smack dab in the middle, but still you have 2 right here in between these sections right here that really complement not only the stitching, but also that very nightmarish, very gothic look of Knightfall Batman, specifically with, again, the trimming at the end that it's funny because in any other situation, I would have nitpicked the fact that it looks very tattered and torn here towards the end when it comes to these like little angles where it kind of cuts and kind of loops into that bat motif. But for Knightfall Batman, that actually complements him because that's exactly how it looked like in the comics, specifically around the end pieces right here, like this one right here. That's how it's supposed to look like, and it looks very quality. Again, it looks exactly like he got lifted from those panels. And to me, having the wire not only be strong enough to be able to put it in those poses, but then loose, I don't want to say loose, but just favorable and manageable enough to then fix it back into a neutral position without ever feeling like, oh, I lost that neutral look. It's gonna coil off and it's going to rebound in a way that is going to be very tedious to manage. No, simply just put it back into a neutral position like so, and there you go. It's back to normal. Business as usual, and I just love capes like that. So you can imagine how giddy I was to see how much of this cape was complementing the articulation, which, to be honest, is pretty basic for a Mafex. You're really not losing too much, except it's all about the quality of the joints themselves that really stood out to me. The head, admittedly, is a little on the squeaky side whenever I got to turning it outside of the box just right away. You can see right there that, yeah, it can rotate 360, but an awful lot of squeaking and tightness happening alongside there, but for good reason, and we'll get to that later when we get to the accessories. But tilting up and down is still pretty favorable, as well as being able to do some slight nudging from side to side. Then the shoulders, yeah, there's quite a bit of movement happening with the joints themselves because they went above and beyond to making sure that you can really flex these butterfly dumbbell joints. But rotating it vertically 360 is kind of lost a little bit, but it had to be by default because of this cape piece with the spike on top. Nevertheless, you can still extend off to the sides very generously, not only because of the hinge inside of the shoulder itself, but also, like I said before, the dumbbell joint that then connects to the inside part of the torso, separated by this washer piece right here to allow more mobility. Naturally, you can also have this joint favor a little bit of butterfly movement right about right there. The biceps are able to rotate fully 360. Two joints at the elbows that are fully able to bend all the way up, except they kind of stop a little short of the full bend only because of the way that the bicep is sculpted right there with those slightly exaggerated proportions. And then, of course, the ball wrist joint that allows the hand to fully rotate 360 as well as bend inwards and outwards. But then we get to the torso where maybe having an 8-pack for abs may not have complemented it very well because it is a little stagnant. You do have this kind of like upside down U shape for the mid-torso cut that can rotate almost the full it can rotate the full 360, but when it comes to crunching in any kind of direction, forwards or back, extension towards the backs is pretty generous, but you'll notice that you have quite a bit of gappage happening right there in that mid-torso cut. And then when it comes to extending forward, because of the way that the joint is designed on the inside, it'll stop right about right there. And, you know, if you do it a little bit in a rush, you could risk of breaking the joint in and of itself. So you just have to be a little bit of extra careful to then kind of shift the joint on the inside part of the torso and then flex forward, and then you'll get your abdominal crunch. Same thing for the waist. I don't know if it's because of the diaper piece or the overall belt part of this, piece right here, but there's just something about it that's just a little too tight that not only squeaks every time I nudge it or move it, but a little bit of the waist movement, whether it be rotation or crunching in any kind of direction, is a little limited. Plus, quite audible due to the fact that you can actually legitimately hear it squeaking. The rest of the legs are pretty par for the course. You have, of course, the drop-down joint that connects the leg to the rest of the overall crotch piece that allows extension of the leg forwards about that far, and then a little bit of extension towards the back before it gets into conflict a little bit with the crotch piece, and then full extension towards the sides that almost meets the 180 degree. However, when you kind of press it back into position, you'll notice the drop down distinction and the gap in between the pieces right there. So all you have to do is just give it a firm press to pop it back into place when you do so. Two joints at the knee that are fully able to bend and feel very fluid, just like Mafex traditionally likes to do, except for the top joints. And this is actually on both. If it was just on one, I'll be like, all right, again, another isolated incident most likely, but both of them squeak at the very top. The bottom joints are fine, but the top a little too tight when it came to the sculpting of this thigh piece. So I don't know if anybody else who owns this figure wants to let me know in the comments if theirs have also squeaky knees or if it's just me. And then the ankles, though the ball joint is very fluid and allows the ankle to be able to pivot upwards and downwards and technically should allow rotation. It's because of the way that it's kind of cuffed and the way that this boot piece right here is sculpted, along with other Batman figures in the past, that I really wish that they stopped doing, with this little part towards the outside being a little bit more elongated than the inside part one. And because of that, when it comes to rotation, it can't really happen. So I kind of wish that there was a way to sculpt it in a very horizontal, kind of just straightforward 180 degree. That way I can get proper rotation there instead of just focusing on the pivoting, which it could technically still do inwards and outwards. However, the toesies can still be found there and are very good in hand, feel very good and fluid in terms of pressing the toes to be able to go almost a full 90 degree upwards like so. But despite my quirks, all of these joints will still allow you to work with the cape and work with the sculpting and the presentation to really deliver on some really good poses that even within an hour of cracking this guy open, I was already kind of messing around with the articulation, messing around with the cape, giving him like this very scary look. And if the default look that he comes with here is not enough, Mafex made sure to prioritize appearance, making sure to prioritize how iconic Knightfall Batman is for some people. So an awful lot of the accessories are very centered on that. Naturally, some of the accessories are going to be pretty basic for your average Batman figure, regardless of company. By default, he's got the fisted hands, but he is going to come with these extending, kind of reaching out hands right about right there. Some extended, open, neutral hands to just kind of go for like a basic pose. And then these, accessory, or rather pinching, holding hands. However, on the side, you'll notice that you have two more pairs of rather unique hands, one of which doesn't really look all that unique to begin with because it looks pretty identical to the fisted hands that he came with, and at first I thought that they threw in a duplicate for some reason. But upon closer inspection, I noticed that the thumb is actually a bit more pronounced and kind of extended outwards. So there's a little bit of a very, very minor gap in between the 4 digits and the thumb, as opposed to the fisted hand where it's completely clenched. So you can almost kind of call these open fisted hands. And at first I didn't know exactly why that was for until I got to one other accessory that I'll get to in a bit. But then the other pair you see over here is, I guess you can consider this a little bit blasphemous for some folks, but I call them the Superman hands because of the way that they're extended and gestated to kind of look like he's flying. But they're meant to pair with other accessories that, again, are probably from a moment in the Knightfall storyline that only happens very, very briefly, and yet Mafex still called to it. Before I get ahead of myself, the reason for why these hands are partially open with the thumb is because he does come with a grapple hook, or rather a batarang, that is then attached to this cable right here. Now, ordinarily, other companies, including Mafex themselves, I think they've done it only once or twice here and there, but for the most part, other companies will resort to either some kind of fiber filament or a cloth, not necessarily cloth, but like a yarn or something to then tie up to their grapple to kind of go for this much more felt look kind of aesthetic to their grapple that you can then have him hold in one hand and then kind of rope it around on the other. This time, Mafex opted for a legit wire filament. This is kind of like the wire similar to that you find in like paper clips that is kind of coiling in and of itself, and technically you can mold and extend to then wrap around the hands and kind of tailor it to how you see fit, which is pretty dope. And the grapple itself, it's nothing to really write home about, but it's really just how you work with it. And cool to see that it's made out of wire, because the way that you kind of twist it and turn it, there's a very likelihood that this is made out of the same material that is then used inside of the cape. And because of that, you're going to be able to then pose it and wire it and sculpt it in a variety of ways that you see fit, while at the same time never feeling like it's going to fall, never having to worry yourself about it slipping to the hand or anything like that. You can simply just take some of this wire, fit it into that open-fisted hand, and have him look like he's holding onto the wire as he's either kind of rappelling down or swinging from it, you name it. So it's pretty cool that this is what they opted in for their grapple. It's cooler still when you reach towards the back of the box and you'll notice you have another cape piece, another cape accessory, which to me looked quite identical. It's got the same trimming, the same hue, the same wires, everything. So I'm like, what exactly is brand new about this? And then I'll notice that if you look at the shoulder piece, he's missing the spikes. And I thought, well, okay, that's kind of cool, variety. You can have one with the spikes, one without the spikes. Why is that really needed? And that's because if you go back to the comics, you'll notice that there's certain shots where he doesn't have the spikes on his shoulders and he has the cape kind of covering his shoulders, and he's going for this very Dracula-inspired look. And when he does so, he's doing it with not only a very scary grimace on his face, but also elongated ears. And Mafex called to that iconic look by throwing in another head sculpt, this time with a grimace showing off the teeth, which in my opinion could have been etched in a little bit better. They look kind of basic, very flat white, so they get kind of lost a little bit on the mouth plate. But overall, very cool expression, a bit more aggressive than this one. And to me, what really stands out is, of course, the much longer ears. Now, do be careful because despite the ears being rather flexible, made out of this kind of like rubberized plastic, they do have a tendency to warp. Every time I swap the heads, I do feel like some of my thumbs, probably because I have very large thumbs, very girthy hands, and therefore I sometimes end up warping my own ears here. So do be careful when positioning the head. But when you do so, and when you remove this cape piece, which is pretty intuitive, he's got 2 pegs on the back and then a tab on the front that fits into a slot. All you have to do is just give it a firm tug and then wrap this one around the neck piece, pop it into place from the back towards the front. And it's funny because at first I was actually kind of scared to do so, considering that if you look towards the back here, you'll notice that you have the pegs slightly covered up by the cloth that is then super glued right next to it. And I thought, okay, well, because of how together everything is right here, it's going to have a tough time of clipping into those holes. Ended up not being the case. It's actually pretty intuitive. It just fits right onto there. I heard well, I didn't really hear it, but I felt the pop happening in place. And then once you fit this, along with the grimacing head, you can then replicate those shots directly from the comics by having this kind of covering his shoulders, covering his arms, and make no mistake, he looks pretty badass doing so. But if you want to opt in for something that I consider to be a little bit more quirky, and you really want to put those Superman hands to good use, apart from either looking like he's flying, looking like he's karate chopping, or even worse, if you have some very insensitive, discriminatory tendencies. I mean, I'm sorry. When I saw the hands, I'm like, someone's gonna do this. Someone's gonna go the extra edgy mile and is gonna post photos, Batman doing a certain something online. And make no mistake, I think if you go through Reddit far enough, you'll find those photos. But if you want to keep it tied to the Knightfall comic and replicate a scene in which he has to use a breathalyzer to then go deep sea diving, I guess you could say, Mafex threw in this breathalyzer head sculpt with the breathalyzer that's coated in yellow, which, to be honest, I kind of don't like that it's yellow. I wish it would have been a little bit silver. But he has the breathalyzer inside of his mouth. It's pretty identical to the default head sculpt, except he's holding the breathalyzer in his mouth. It's not removable, so don't get it twisted. You can't have a pouting Batman face there. It's built right into the head sculpt itself. And then they also threw in this neck piece, this collar neck piece, that's pretty much sans the cape. So essentially, it's the exact same collar piece that he's got on his person right now, but without any of the cloth pieces. So therefore, you can make it look like he removed this cape, and the functionality of being able to swap it is pretty identical. You have the 2 pegs, the tab right there, fit it in along with this head, and he's pretty much a capeless Batman. But then once you fit the Superman hands or the karate chop swimming hands, then he looks a bit more like he's ready to take a skinny dip dive, and therefore is able to replicate that panel. Now, I don't personally see myself, or even an awful lot of collectors, replicating that panel, but the option is in fact still there. And that is exactly what Mafex always kind of strives for when it comes to the value that they pack in with their figures, is the value, and it's calling back to those appearances to give some of their very predominant characters, whether it be Batman or Spider-Man, shelf presence, making sure that that money that you spend is going to go towards something that is a little high tier and kind of goes above the average line of like, oh, I didn't know that they were going to throw that in there. Well, there it is. And outside of the basic translucent base that he, along with plenty of other Mafex figures, comes with, this is exactly what you get for. And in certain markets, it is a little bit on the steep side. This guy normally retails for about $100 to $110, maybe even $120 in certain markets when you do get it within the States. But if you can still pull and you don't mind waiting a little bit by importing the figure for a slightly more discounted rate of like somewhere between $75 to $85, this guy is more than worth it. Sure, on paper, it could seem a little basic when you get down to the accessories, because I'm usually an accessory guy, and you'll notice that an awful lot of the times, I do wish that they would have more than just the basic hands, and maybe as far as personal tastes are concerned, some of the accessories you do get with, you kind of look at and scratch your head a little bit. To me, I think the ones that are pretty self-evident here is the breathalyzer head along with the extended hands right there. I mean, I get it. I get why it's included there. It was in the comics, but at the same time, I feel like something else probably would have, maybe a kind of like in pain head sculpt to then replicate something that's a bit more iconic, which is of course the cover of Knightfall, where you have Bane breaking his back and he's in pain. Maybe a battle damaged head, maybe some scarring on the gloves. I don't know, but something in that direction probably would have benefited the package more. And that's why at the $100 to $110, maybe $120 mark, I do consider it to be a little bit steep. But if you were to be a little bit patient and manage to find them through an imported Japanese site like Hobby Link, Hobby Genki, Plaza Japan, etc., he is most definitely worth it, because once you get to the replayability of working with his cloth cape, getting him into poses, working with these hands, working with the traditional Mafex articulation, this guy made me smile more times than I can ever have imagined pulling him out of the box. And that's coming from someone who is familiar with Knightfall, has read a few of the issues, didn't get to Knight's End, but doesn't have the strongest affinity. I understand its cultural significance, but it's not one of my favorite comic arcs of all time. And yet this guy may end up being one of my favorite Batman Mafex figures of all time. And in saying that, I have practically no choice but to give it a very solid, firm, and certifiable 9 out of 10. Guys, if you can come across this guy for a really good deal, like I said, probably keep it at either 100 or less, then definitely pick him up. If it's a little bit over 100, then you really do need to kind of ask yourself how much of a high regard do you hold the Knightfall storyline? Is this your definitive Batman? Do you consider this to be more definitive than, say, Batman Hush or animated series Batman or any of the movie interpretations? And then that kind of answers your question. For me, I would say that even with someone who doesn't have that much of a deep connection to the Knightfall storyline, this still has just so much distinction and personality that it's going to make it very difficult to part ways with it later on. And sure, McFarlane and Figuarts and all these other companies can kind of take their whack at this portrayal, but so far, I feel like the bar has been raised with Mafex's interpretation, even if they are still kind of going back to the well of certain, blueprints and certain schematics that have worked with them so far, but at least if they can just kind of take things and improve on them, like they did with the cape, which to me really stands out, then we got ourselves a winner. And Mafex will probably still keep a customer in me. So if you guys have managed to pre-order the Knightfall Batman from Mafex, did you guys get yours in already? What do you guys think about him? Do you love him? Do you dislike him? Do you think that he could have been a little bit better? And if you haven't picked him up, did this review in any kind of shape or form kind of sway you in one direction or another? Or do you think that Mafex should probably look at other characters to give them their time in the spotlight apart from Batman? Or do you think that there's a reason for why they keep making Batman is because Batman sells? I think I just answered the question for you. My apologies. But regardless of what you have to say, I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say in the comment section. And while you're down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review / little bit of a comparison. Hit the thumbs down if you did not like it. And as always, stay humble, and I'll catch you guys later. Take care.